Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolon Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolon is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors. I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutors Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutors Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my ballistic co-host, Brett.
I'm so angry right now, Alice. No, that's not what this is about at all. This is another one of those awesome interviews, our favorite ones where we don't have to talk much because we have someone so much more impressive and intelligent to talk about crime gun intelligence than we are.
Absolutely. You guys have been asking for more information about ballistics, explosives, ATF. You hear about it in many of the cases that we cover, but we are not the experts. So what do we do best? We bring on the experts. And today we have an incredible guest. We have Special Agent in Charge Christopher Amon, who was appointed as the SAC of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives of the Chicago Field Division in March of 2003. For those of you who know the acronyms and the alphabet soup, Chris is a huge deal in the ATF, and he's based in Chicago, which if you follow true crime, it might be a very active part. He's been in ATF for about 20 years. While he has been at ATF, he was chief of the Firearms Operation Division, managing the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. Some of you may know it as NIBIN, and the NIBIN National Correlation and Training Center, and ATF's Crime Gun Intelligence Programs. I could go on, but you guys don't want to hear me talk about Chris. You want to hear from Chris himself. Thank you so much for being here. Is it okay if I call you Chris? In the field, we, of course, would call you the SAC.
No, that's fine. Thank you for that kind introduction. That was really nice. I'm really not that impressive, but I will replay that for my mom someday. Thank you.
Well, I didn't do you justice. And can you just give our listeners a little bit of background as to how someone in your position gets to this position? Take us back to how you got started in this field and how you ended up where you are today.
Sure. So I grew up in New York City during kind of a transitional time as far as violent crime reduction. I grew up in the 90s in New York City, the 80s and 90s. Back then, as you remember, New York City was a very violent place, kind of undergoing a lot of changes. So my interest in law enforcement really started then, growing up, high school in New York City. When I was growing up, it was a very violent place, over 2,000 murders a year. I grew up in Brooklyn, which was obviously ground zero for a lot of that violent activity, not particularly where I lived, but it was kind of ever present when you grew up in New York in those days. So staying in New York, I ended up attending Fordham University, where I enrolled mostly in criminal justice related classes, kind of had dreams of going into the NYPD. And this was just after 9/11. At the time, the starting salary for the NYPD was not a lot. It wasn't enough to live in New York City. So I started looking at different options as far as federal law enforcement, looked at DEA, ICE at the time, ATF, FBI. But I was really drawn to ATF's mission because it really was focused on violent crime, and violent crime specifically that was, where individuals utilize firearms. So for me, that was just an interesting mission. solving those types of crimes where people were using firearms to do harm to others. I had seen so much of that, growing up, and I had seen so much of that across the country that to me, that mission really, really was important to me. So in about 2005, I joined ATF and I was immediately sent to the Denver Field Division. So at the time, our director was former Secret Service. So there was very much this idea. They didn't want to put you where you were from. So I looked at the sheet they give you and they say, where do you want to go? And I said, well, it's like that New Yorker map where it's New York and then everything else. So I said, okay, the Bronx, Brooklyn, New Jersey, maybe I would go to Philadelphia if I absolutely had to. And then I get the call and it says, how about Denver? So I took out the map. I looked, I said, okay, I'll go to Denver. But no, I started my career as a special agent in Denver in 2005. And it really was a great place to learn the job because there was a big urban and rural divide. So I got to work both sides. So urban inner city violence, firearms trafficking, and then got to go out and work investigations in rural areas, armed narcotics trafficking, and the types of places growing up as a city kid that I never thought I would find myself.
There are worse places to end up than Denver. Did you take up skiing while you were out there, or did you avoid that?
Well, if I had only known, being so New York centric, I said, oh, it's Denver. And, all my buddies were joking about how I'd learned to ski. I said, I'll never learn to ski. I left 12 years later. I had two of the nicest sets of skis and boots. I had the mountain pass. So I had the pass that allowed you to go to all the mountains. So I completely turned into a Denver native.
So you talked a little bit about the rural and city divide. And I think one thing that we run into a lot with our listeners is they don't understand, because it's hard to understand, the role that federal law enforcement plays in local law enforcement. So what role does ATF play in supporting local cops, state cops, police departments across the country?
So supporting state and local law enforcement is at the core of ATF's mission. We were basically created as a bureau in 1972. We were born out of a piece of legislation called the Gun Control Act. This was enacted in 1968 after a lot of historical famous assassinations, Robert F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. So basically the Gun Control Act was passed and provided the framework for the modern ATF. What I mean by that was it passed a set of laws of people who were prohibited from possessing firearms. It also set up a regulatory scheme for federal firearms licensees. So really ATF's mission, which was, dates back to the Prohibition era and Treasury Department, and I could certainly get into the history of that, but if we want to keep it as 1972 and beyond, the Gun Control Act, that was really the seminal moment that created ATF and everything we do. But as part of that, the act was passed to better support state and local law enforcement in their fight against violent crime, meaning that we bring a unique tool set to help state and local law enforcement. The idea that crime is transient. Crime goes across city borders, county borders, and obviously state borders. So having a federal agency that can come in and help conduct those types of investigations that are not just unique to one area, but that affect the entire area. So that's kind of the framework for a lot of federal law enforcement, but specifically ATF, and specifically with our firearms mission.
And, we see a lot of cases, and we've talked about how a lot of violent crime in the cases we cover tend to be prosecuted locally because of the laws that are violated. How does ATF either get brought in, or do you invite yourself? Kind of where you can't obviously get involved in every single state and local type of cases. So are there certain metrics or kind of parameters you're looking at in order to determine how to use the limited resources that ATF does have?
Absolutely. So as part of what we like to say, our number one mission is to protect the public from violent crime. So narrowing down on that mission, one thing we look at is firearms trafficking. So firearms that are diverted from the legal to an illegal market. So illicit firearms trafficking, how guns are getting into these cities and into the hands of prohibited persons. That would be an example of a time where ATF would be involved in an investigation. So you'd have, let's say, a felon who's found in possession of a firearm. That firearm is traced, and we find out that that was illegally purchased for that felon by somebody else. So in that instance, you would have two federal violations. You would have a felon in possession of a firearm, which is a federal crime, as I mentioned, from 1968, dating all the way back to the Gun Control Act. And then you would have the crime of the straw purchase, which occurred when somebody lied on a form to purchase that firearm for someone who is prohibited. So in real simple terms, that would be an example. Now, of course, from that, there's all kinds of other federal laws that we look at to attack gangs and organized crime. There's statutes that we use to attack gang violence, for instance. Your listeners may be familiar with the RICO Act, Racketeering Act, that was passed in the 70s that basically gave the federal government the tools they needed to attack organized crime. So again, bringing federal resources and applying our expertise to those types of investigations. But most importantly, there's two tools that we have that I want to talk about today that help us in these investigations. There's two kind of foundational elements that we call crime gun intelligence. So when we talk about crime gun intelligence, there's two things. There's our firearms tracing program, which allows us to trace firearms. So that's where we recover a firearm in a crime, or state and local law enforcement recovers a firearm. They're taking the information from that firearm, the make, model, manufacturer, serial number, and importer, putting that into a system called eTrace that ATF administers. And then from that, we have experts who are able to trace that firearm back to the original purchaser. So that's one thing. That's how we attack the firearms trafficking problem. Second thing we can do is now look to see kind of the life of that gun. So we can see where that gun was used. And this is where ballistics comes in. This is our NIBIN program, the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. So it's basically a large database of spent shell casings from crime scenes throughout the country that are uploaded via digital photographs into a database. So we'll take that recovered firearm, we'll test fire it. So we'll get 2 exemplar shell casings, enter it into the database, and see if that gun is tied to any other violent crimes. So through both of those, we're able to find out how the gun was diverted, and then along the life of that gun, how it was used. And a lot of interesting stories kind of in between that come out that help our investigations, as you can imagine.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think most people's knowledge of law enforcement investigative techniques probably comes from CSI, Law and Order, that sort of thing. So I think people are generally aware of ballistics and generally aware of this notion that you can somehow match fired rounds or various things like that. You've talked about NIBIN. Expand on that a little bit, because I think people, they have that very basic knowledge, but I think they would be surprised at how robust this system is and how national it is and how far reaching you guys can go when you're tracing a firearm that is used in various shootings.
So, I'll back up a little bit and go over kind of the history of the program and kind of how we got to where we are today to having it be this premier part of ATF strategy, this critical tenet of crime gun intelligence. It wasn't 20 years ago. So this program's been around since roughly 1997, but there was a sea change in about 2014 for how we use this technology. So you always had the ability since 97 to automate this process. So shell casings, for lack of a better word, the formal term is cartridge case, but colloquially known as a shell casing for most of your listeners. Shell casings are recovered at crime scenes. They're then uploaded into the NIBIN database. So that's been happening for a long time. But really the change that happened was using it as a lead generating tool. So what I mean by that, it was originally used basically by scientists at a crime laboratory on the back end. So it was done after all of the casework was done relating to a firearm or cartridge cases. It was then kind of put into NIBIN as an afterthought. So NIBIN leads were often a year behind. So most agents' experiences, including mine when I was working cases, was that NIBIN was not really a valuable program. So you have this program that's kind of struggling until about 2014, when a group of agents and a crime lab in Denver, a guy by the name of Dr. Greg LaBerge, said, what if we did this in a timely manner? What if we turned around these shell casings and we entered them all in and we were turning them around within 24 to 48 hours? And then what if we had an investigative team behind that? So to follow up on these leads as we're getting them in real time, as we're tracking shooters. So you're having a shooting on a Monday, shooting on a Friday, we're making the connection by the next Monday. So real-time forensics. So this shift to being a front-end investigative tool came about in about 2014 and really started in Denver with a group of investigators and a lab director who was very much on the cutting edge of these types of things, meaning that he was willing to change his processes within the lab to put this on the front end. And that wasn't true in many labs. NIBIN existed for all the years leading up to 2014, almost exclusively in labs. So basically it's a terminal, it's a little thing that comes out like a Keurig machine. You enter the cartridge case, it's oriented, you hear a bunch of sounds, which is it's taking the photographs of that case, and then it uploads it into the system. That terminal can be anywhere. It could be right here in my house, technically, if I had the right security and lines. Doesn't necessarily have to be in a lab, but that's where it was originally housed for all of those years. So leading up to it, the labs just kind of treated it how, labs treat a lot of things, which is very disciplined and just kind of part of a host of other things that labs do. And labs obviously have a lot of functions in modern crime labs. So Another thing we looked at in 2014 was also taking it out of the lab. So putting it, kind of how a fingerprint machine would be in a police department. When you're fingerprinting somebody, something that's so routine now that searches the automated system to see if you're wanted, to see if you're involved in any other crimes. That's something that's been routine since I think going back to the 70s, maybe it was Ted Bundy, I believe, where there was one where they missed matching the fingerprints, and that was kind of the genesis for the automated fingerprint identification system. So the idea of taking this technology and putting it in a setting where law enforcement could utilize the results in real time, 24 to 48 hours. And that was really the change that happened in 2014 that is now fully taken off across the country. And now it's one of the most effective law enforcement programs and the foundation of our violent crime strategy at ATF.
So I want to hear more about how it goes on from 2014, but I want to break it down because we hear about NIBIN, we hear about ballistics, and I think generally people understand that if you have a fingerprint, literally the picture of the fingerprint is, uploaded onto a database and there's electronic matching. But when you're talking about uploading shell casing or cartridge casing information from a lab, what does that mean? And I take this all the way back to, you said a gun can have a make, model, and then of course a serial number that makes it unique. Are you saying that every single gun will shoot or leave markings on the cartridge or the casing in the exact same way? And can you know that even if you don't have the original gun in your possession that spent that casing?
Absolutely. So that is the basis behind this technology, but firearms identification in general as a science. So basically, each firearm leaves unique markings on that cartridge case or bullet. For the sake of NIBIN, we'll talk about cartridge cases today that's ejected from a semi-automatic firearm, but also bullets as well. But for the purposes of this conversation in NIBIN, we'll talk about cartridge cases. So they have unique characteristics that it leaves on that cartridge case. They're called individual characteristics. So those individual characteristics are unique to that firearm and that firearm only. And studies have shown that even if you take firearms that are sequentially manufactured, at the same time, one behind another, they're still going to leave unique markings because of the manufacturing process. So there have been studies that have validated this. The foundation of this science dates all the way back to the 1920s. Actually, right here in Chicago was Dr. Calvin Goddard, who's considered to be the father of firearms identification because he was able to match the shell casings from the St. Valentine's Day massacre to the firearms. He was able to, at that time, the big conclusion that he was able to draw was that it wasn't a police firearm that was involved, that it was involved in the gangs, and hence that this was a criminal act not perpetrated by the police. So the foundation of that science goes all the way back to the 1920s. There's been studies done from the 20s all the way up until the modern day that basically validate this science. However, it wasn't automated until NIBIN. So there wasn't an automated database. So literally in the 90s, you'd have people that would look at Polaroids of different cases within their little individual AOR. I remember talking to a firearms examiner in Suffolk County who, as of I think it was 2010 or 11, still had that book. So it was like Suffolk County crime scenes, and they would take photos of the casings and try to look at them to do what NIBIN does. So prior to 97, there was no automation. So NIBIN comes on board and now it's automated. But of course, it took many years, number one, for the technology to improve. So now it's 3D, HD 3D. So you're able to look at those individual markings on the cartridge case with HD photography and with 3D. So you're able to spin it. You're able to really get a good image of that cartridge case before it's uploaded and then compare it against the database of millions of cartridge cases. And that work is actually done in Huntsville, Alabama. So that's done in an ATF facility in Huntsville, Alabama, where you have what we call correlation review specialists who basically sit there in NIBIN sites, which is that machine I told you about. And the site can be at a lab or it could be at a police department. In the case of Chicago, it's over at their laboratory in downtown Chicago. So those cartridge cases are uploaded into NIBIN. And then you have all these specialists in Huntsville who sit in a room, 200 approximately, I actually believe more now. And all they do is review those images against the database and then return those leads within 48 hours. So they're comparing images of cartridge cases all day. The algorithm will say, this is your top 20, this is your top 30. We believe number one is the highest based on these factors. They'll make the lead and then they'll return that lead in a package back to the investigator. But they're doing that in 48 hours or less.
That's amazing. I don't think I even realized how high tech it's gotten. So basically, sort of the computer makes the first match, and then one of those people in Huntsville takes a look at it to sort of confirm that what the computer is seeing is legitimate. Is that what's happening?
Yes. So at the individual NIBIN site, that person is responsible just for uploading it. So just for orientating the cartridge case, making sure it's clean, getting a good image. That image then says, okay, you have a good image. And then the folks in Huntsville are responsible for searching the database to make those leads. Now, when they make a lead, it's then peer reviewed. So one of their specialists has to peer review their work. And then we have firearms examiners. So the scientists who go through the training sitting in Huntsville who will then sign off on that lead. So when a detective or an ATF agent somewhere in the United States gets that lead back, it's been reviewed by 3 people, including a firearms examiner who is the true expert. Our correlation review specialists are also experts. They're experts at finding leads. But that firearms examiner is signing off on it and endorsing that lead to go back to the investigator so it can be used in their investigation. Now, when you go to trial, and this is a whole other thing that we can get into, but when you go to trial, you actually have to pull the evidence and have a firearms examiner, usually at your local site, review the evidence under a comparison microscope and then make that determination that it's a match or make an identification so that it can be admitted at trial. So the leads that we produce in Huntsville are just to get that case going. They're high confidence correlations, we call them. We've done our own studies that show that they're 99.3% accurate, meaning that they're later confirmed by the examiner 99.3% of the time. Also, we're using an algorithm and technology to make the match. So while there is a human who has to go in there and look physically at them, our high-speed algorithm is telling us, based on this entire database and all of these different factors, we believe your match is actually present in number 1, 2, or 3.
So we already knew when ATF approved you to come on this podcast that we would be superfluous. We wouldn't need to ask questions because you would be able to explain everything. No. I truly, no, we have no questions because you have such knowledge that I'm like, I don't know what follow-up questions to ask. But one of the things I really picked up on, and I think you've done a great job of explaining, is you keep emphasizing that these NIBIN matches are leads. And we've explained this in other contexts to people where, like a DNA match, if they do a trash pull and they get someone's saliva off a cup, that may be a lead to then help them go on their next investigation. It may be that lead leads nowhere, but obviously here we're talking about a firearm and there's going to be a lot of reasons why that lead will be very weighty. Can you explain a little bit about what this lead is that you're coming back with? Is it that they're identifying the gun, the original purchaser, and or connecting that particular unique gun casing or cartridge to other shootings that may be in the database?
So typically what you'll see, and we now actually have a program within ATF that automates and organizes all of the leads. So what you'll get back is, so if, let's just say you enter, there's a shooting on a Saturday night in Chicago. No gun is recovered. Everybody leaves the scene. You have no suspects. Cartridge cases hit the ground. Those are recovered. They're entered. 48 hours later, we will get something back saying that your shooting Saturday in the Loop, let's just say, matches to 5 other shootings, and it'll give us all of the dates, 5 other shootings that occurred within the past 4 months. Now, that's a great example because that'll be a really good lead, because now you have what we would say is a hot gun, a gun that's actively being used. And now we can go and look at those other 4 shootings and we can say, okay, what are the common factors? This is the same gang. Okay. Now we'll go back and look at witness statements from the Saturday shooting, and someone may tell us after the fact, oh, it was this gang, this person. And we're able to connect those shootings. We also can see if the other shootings are solved. So is there anyone who was arrested and that gun changed hands and was used again? So there's lots of things you can find out. Now, if the gun is recovered, that's where you really have solid evidence because you have it with somebody. So most times it's recovered on someone's person. And through that, you then do a test fire. So you go to the lab, you test fire the exemplars, you put them in. So this person's sitting in custody, hopefully. Oh, that really depends these days. But hopefully they're in custody while you're finding this out. 48 hours later, you find out that that gun was used in a murder 2 days before, an aggravated assault a month before. And now you know that this gun possession suspect, there's a lot more to that case. So when I talk about ATF's role in violent crime and how these types of programs can assist state and local law enforcement, these are really huge in these investigations because it's able to tell us a lot more about the suspects than may have otherwise been known.
And we talk a lot on the show about shooters. That's where our focus is. We are looking for the people who are firing the guns. Those are the people we want to get. And I want to break this down a little bit for our listeners as to how exactly this works. So for those of you out there, and you can correct me because you probably know more about firearms than I do, but for those of you out there who aren't that firearm familiar. So the bullet itself, it's in a casing, which you've mentioned. It has some gunpowder in that casing. And when the firing pin of a firearm strikes the back of the casing, it ignites the gunpowder. The bullet leaves the gun, goes wherever it's going to go. And then in a semi-automatic, the casing is ejected. So there are, I think, a few areas where you guys are able to get markings that can help you identify a weapon. So my understanding is when you put a bullet into a magazine, the magazine itself can leave identifiable markings on the round, that when that bullet is pulled into the gun, that action can leave identifiable markings on the gun. If for some reason the bullet is ejected before it's even fired, you just eject the round because for whatever reason you're racking the gun, the ejector can leave markings on the round. When you fire the gun, the pin from the gun striking the back can leave identifying markings. And then when the bullet is leaving the barrel, the rifling in the gun can leave identifying markings. Can you go through those and sort of tell me where I was wrong and tell me how all that works?
Get this, adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Wondery. Greenlight.com/Wondery.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
No, you got it. All of those do leave unique markings that you mentioned, but specifically for the purposes of NIBIN and what we're looking at, it's 3 regions of interest, and you nailed them. So the first being the firing pin impression. So in the start of that sequence, of the ignition sequence, as you mentioned, the firing pin impression, the breech face mark. So when that casing is slammed back against the breech face, that's another unique mark, and then the ejector mark. So those 3 are the unique markings that the system looks at against all of the other cartridge case exemplars in the system. So those 3 regions of interest, as they're called, is what NIBIN looks at. And each one of them are automated and they give scores. So you may have one that scores high in firing pin, but not as much in ejector mark. So that's what those folks in Huntsville are looking at. But a lot of that is automated and it's done by the NIBIN system. So again, taking a little bit of that human element out of it. But then again, I will caution though, when you do admit this evidence at trial, a firearms examiner physically pulls the evidence. So it goes and collects all the evidence, not automated, physically the evidence, and will look under a microscope and look at those regions of interest and come up with their determination. And basically, there's a few different determinations they can make. Either an identification is made, it's inconclusive, it's eliminated, or it's unsuitable for comparison.
So because of these different phases that leave unique markings, does this mean that we've talked a lot about fired rounds and how they can leave marks? Does this mean that you can have an unspent casing? First of all, can you explain how a round can be unspent, like how a round can go into a gun but ultimately be unspent? Does it mean that NIBIN can also identify an unspent round? And is that any different in terms of accuracy than identifying a round that's been fired?
So typically the round would have to be fired. Unspent would be, someone ejecting a round from the chamber. Often what you will find live rounds on the ground during shooting scenes because you'll have someone who thinks they have to put a round in the chamber, but there already is one there, so you have a live round. A firearms examiner could look at that to look specifically against that firearm if it's recovered, but typically NIBIN looks at fired cartridge cases. FCCs, as we call them, is the terminology that's used. So when I talk about the automation, it's on fired cartridge cases. But if there was one that was ejected that wasn't fired, an examiner could look at that and try to make a match. But typically for NIBIN, you wouldn't enter a round. Now, the exception when I talk about a test fire, that's when you take a firearm that's recovered, you put 2 rounds in of the same caliber as the firearm, obviously. You take 2 shots. So now it's marked on that firearm. So now it's made the unique markings of that gun. And then you enter them into NIBIN and look for the matches that way.
And I assume one of the reasons you do that with NIBIN is because you mentioned 3 different areas that NIBIN is looking at. And when you fire the gun, you're going to get all three. Whereas if you just eject it, you're going to have the ejector mark, but you're not going to have the firing pin, for instance, and you're not going to have, I forget the third one you mentioned, but you're not going to have that.
The breech face mark.
The breech face mark.
And
exactly.
Yes. And you're not probably going to have the best ejector mark similar you would as if it were actually fired.
So let me ask you this. We've talked about casings. What about bullets themselves?
So the automation of bullets exists. It's a system called bullet tracks. But as you could imagine, so bullets, first of all, for one-to-one identifications, meaning you recover a firearm, you recover a projectile, either from an individual who was shot or from a crime scene, that obviously exists as part of the firearms identification science to match it to a gun. Just like cartridge cases, that's been around since the 1920s. It's been upheld in courts throughout, modern history. However, for the automation of that program really is not really robust, so to speak. There is a program called Bullet Tracks, but the reason is actually should be, I think it's pretty easy to understand, is that it's very hard to recover bullets. NIBIN relies on kind of the random. You want NIBIN to make connections that you didn't know existed. So if you think about it, trying to extract bullets, if you show up at a crime scene where there's no victims, the effort that it would take to go find that projectile, pull it out of a wall, go find it 300 yards away, and then enter it into a system, that's just not there yet. We spent the better part of the last 10 years preaching comprehensive collection of cartridge cases, of shell casings. So we've really done a great job around the country training law enforcement on the importance of picking up spent shell casings. So to go to bullets, it's just far too difficult at this point to automate that process, although the technology does exist.
I would assume also with bullets, the great thing about cartridges is they get ejected, they're laying on the ground, presumably nothing happens to them afterwards, where when you fire a bullet, it can be in any type of shape by the time you see it. It can hit things, it can be deformed. There's all sorts of reasons it would be harder with that.
Absolutely. That's also another issue. Absolutely. That the condition that it needs to be in also, as part of that program I mentioned with the automation, that the condition that the projectile needs to be in order to get a good image to be able to compare it to the database. There's a whole host of issues as to why that process has never really taken off. But as far as the one-for-one comparisons from an examiner, meaning you have a gun, you have a bullet, you think there's a match, and you're trying to make that connection in court, that happens all the time.
So let me ask you this, and we don't have to go into specifics too much, but like every area of forensic science, defense attorneys are often pushing back on it and saying, hey, maybe we should pump the brakes on this. Maybe it's not quite as good as the experts want us to think. What do you say to folks who doubt ballistics as a forensic science?
Well, I would say that, speaking, on behalf of ATF, obviously we are extremely confident in the science. Again, the foundations go back all the way to 1926. It's been upheld in courts since then. I think this is really subject of the modern era. I think it was a 2009 report that originally came out questioning the science, basically saying that it didn't have an error rate. So between 2009 and 2016, there were 6 studies that were conducted, a couple of groundbreaking ones at the Miami-Dade lab, I believe another one in Kansas, basically where they did a blind study. They found firearms that were manufactured sequentially, and then they had examiners come in, look at bullets, look at cartridge cases that were fired to try to determine the exact match. And through those studies, they were able to produce that error rate. So, recently there's been some adverse court rulings, one in Illinois where I believe the state of Maryland, I believe it was the high court in Maryland that basically is disallowing the expert testimony in this area. So there have been some recent challenges to this, but from someone who's been a practitioner, as far as the investigations, I can tell you, number one, as you guys both know from conducting investigations, you're never relying on one thing. It's very rare. If you look at the arrest warrants that we do where we use NIBIN, there's a whole host of other probable cause that goes into that. So I would say, number one, it's very rare. And in any of the cases that I've conducted, overseen as a manager, where the NIBIN lead is it. That's all you have to charge the suspect. So it's that lead. It's very similar to a drug test kit, that shows you, yes, this is narcotics. Yes, these two match. And I would even argue that the NIBIN technology is more reliable than most drug test kits. So I'm very comfortable, obviously, with its use in investigations. We know it works through our investigations, through the fact that we're linking these crimes in other ways. But from a scientific perspective, and I'm not a scientist, I'm not a firearms examiner. I ran the NIBIN program, but I'm not a firearms examiner. But I believe that, automation is the future. So some of the things they're looking at now is to have, during that identification process with an examiner, use a process that basically is able to give you a degree of certainty that those two cases are from the same firearm. So there's automated processes they're working through. I think NIST did a study on this. So this is coming. I think there'll be some advances in this that overcome that human eye looking under a microscope that we've relied on for so many years. There'll be automation coming here in the very near future that will help defeat a lot of those arguments that the science isn't valid.
And we know that this has been, a science that's been around for a long time. But to give people an idea of just how often NIBIN is used, do you have any sort of metrics on volume? Are we talking about, could anyone submit to NIBIN, any state and local officer? Does it have to reach some sort of metric? Because you guys are returning these leads within 48 hours. That seems like a very high turnover rate. What are we talking about in terms of volume for what NIBIN is looking at in terms of helping generate these leads?
So just pulled the numbers today. It's kind of funny to say it's the end of the fiscal year. You remember the government at the end of the fiscal year, we all have to look at our numbers and statistics for the year. So across the Chicago Field Division, in which our AOR is 4 judicial districts, so Central Illinois, Northern Illinois, Eastern Wisconsin, and Northern Indiana, ATF and mostly our state and local partners acquired 31,000 cartridge cases this fiscal year.
Wow.
Resulting in, I believe the number was 11,000 NIBIN leads. Now, the large majority of those come from Chicago and Milwaukee, as you could imagine.
Sure.
So the second question was about the standards. So we're doing this 48-hour turnaround down in Huntsville. How do we ensure that the state and local agencies are, number one, collecting everything so that we're having that good database to be able to match crimes? Because if somebody shoots at a stop sign one day and commits a murder the next day, you want to be able to connect those. You don't want the stop sign shooting sitting in a backlog or not being entered at all because it doesn't seem important. So the main principle, and I didn't get into this earlier, but is comprehensive collection. Everything goes in. So we train with all of our state and local partners on these principles. The 2 major cities in our AOR of Chicago and Milwaukee are unbelievable when it comes to comprehensive collection. They're collecting everything and they're getting it in within 24 hours. So in the 2 major cities within my field division, we are extremely confident in the best practices that are being applied. In fact, Chicago was recently, by our auditing group, ATF has a group that comes in and audits NIBIN sites for what we call our minimum required operating standards. So basically ensuring timeliness, proper procedures are being followed at your NIBIN site. So Chicago was recently awarded the gold standard for that, meaning that they follow all of the procedures as prescribed by ATF in our manuals. So we're getting a ton of intelligence from this program in Chicago. When I was the ASAC in Washington, D.C., it was the same. That was another really good NIBIN site there. And we were making thousands of connections each year. As you could imagine, with all of these leads, the next kind of step is, well, who's investigating them all? In Chicago, we have over 3,000 of these connections made a year. So that's a lot of leads being returned. So one of the things that I'll plug that we recently did here was we set up a crime gun intelligence center. So we have 13 state, local, and federal agencies that all sit in one space in downtown Chicago to review this intelligence. So they're reviewing all of the shootings that are linked by NIBIN. They're reviewing the traces that come back to look for trafficking indicators and firearms traffickers. And then we're putting it all together under one roof so that we can really go after the shooters. Brett earlier had talked about that. How do you get to the shooters? Well, it's really a whole of government effort, meaning that you have to have all of the agencies there. We opened in April, and one of the first cases that we found was a guy who was involved in a shooting outside of Wrigley Field, and it was actually an HSI prior defendant. So because HSI, or Homeland Security Investigations, was sitting at our task force, we were able to identify this person. So when you're looking at gun violence and trying to make all these connections, you really have to have that whole of government approach. And that's one thing we're doing in Chicago to make sure we're making good use of this technology and these unbelievable leads that we're getting, within 48 hours.
Right, that truly is a staggering number. We're thinking about it from the prosecutor perspective. Like if you handed me 3,000 leads, that is just an overwhelming workload, incredible knowledge, but also to put into perspective for people that, this automation and the database is allowing us to generate these leads, but you still need bodies to actually investigate. Kind of drawing that same analogy to CODIS that we talked about with the DNA fingerprints. We know that CODIS, the database grows over time as more fingerprints are added to it. Is that how NIBIN works as well, as more casings are collected across the nation? And you're talking about just in your, region, there could be 31,000 maybe uploaded. They may not all be unique, but in that one area. Is that how NIBIN works as well? Or is there a additional way to add these unique markings to the database?
So absolutely. You just continue to add to the database. I think one of the oldest leads I've seen was a 2023 gun that linked back to a firearm from 2015. So you'll occasionally see very old leads in the database. So everything stays there and it's constantly searching against your region. So yes, the more you add to the database, the more connections you can make. It's not really, I would say, you don't often see that many that are kind of, as part of like a cold case type of tool, but you do see occasionally leads with a 6-year spread. It really is most effective though, when you talk about going after shooters and trying to look at gang conflicts and patterns in real time, you will really see the tight timeframes between these shootings. So if you have that comprehensive program and you're putting everything in, I mentioned the stop sign shooting earlier, or, individuals who use a field to test out their gun. There was one location we once identified that we kept seeing, cartridge case recoveries, but no one was ever arrested. It was an empty field where these gang members would go to test their firearms, but then it was linking to all of these other crimes where that gang was associated. And they were linking just within, 90, 120 days. It's really remarkable. There's studies, I think it was Rutgers that did a study of escalating violence. So it used the NIBIN data to look at it and say, okay, when NIBIN links 3 shootings, 50% of the time between the second and third shooting was 90 days. So when you talk about an active shooter, these are folks that aren't going to stop until we intervene in law enforcement. And you can't intervene if you're getting a lead a year later. And that's really the whole principle behind what we do at our Crime Gun Intelligence Center and ATF offices around the country and other crime gun intelligence centers, is really making sure that we stop that activity. I will say it's very difficult just because of a lot of the challenges you face in law enforcement today, but it's something that we put a lot of resources to because it's really worthy. And then also, too, when number one, you have to address those people that are caught with the firearms. You have to make sure that that's not undiscovered. That's step one. You probably remember your traditional PSN programs. So Project Safe Neighborhoods, where the Felon with a Gun program, where everybody gets together, monthly and you review criminal histories and you flip through and you decide which defendant's going to go to state court or federal court. Well, we've really put a front end focus on those programs too, to identify the shooters that immediately need to go to federal court, where, they have a higher likelihood of being detained versus most state courts, but not doing that 2 months later when that person may have bonded out of state court and they're out committing other crimes. As studies have showed us of these shooters, they're going to go get another gun and they're going to use it in shooting. So all of those different ways that this intelligence informs ATF's operations, it's really been a paradigm shift for us, really moving things to the front end and having that sense of urgency.
Yeah, in counterterrorism, we talk about left of boom. You want to stop the bomber before the explosion. And I feel like what you guys are doing is stopping the shooter before the shooting. And it's so important. And I could talk about crime gun intelligence all night, but I do want to give you an opportunity to sort of educate our listeners on a new problem that people don't know it's in their cities and towns, but it absolutely is. It's a common misconception that machine guns are illegal in the United States. They're actually not illegal, but they're really, really hard to get, at least legally. But recently, we've seen an influx of what we used to call Glock switches, because essentially when we saw them initially, you could take a regular Glock 9mm handgun, and with a little piece of metal, you turn that Glock handgun into a machine gun. We now call them machine gun conversion devices because you can use them on any firearm, and I think Glock got tired of being singled out. Anyway, can you tell us a little bit about what these are, how they work, and what ATF is doing to stop them?
Sure. So the machine gun conversion device started to come about in about 2019. We started seeing these mostly in our cities and urban areas. They started to be recovered. We were covering firearms with these on, but basically what it is a machine gun conversion device, a small device. It's attached to the rear slide of a handgun, and it converts it from semi-automatic, so one pull of the trigger, one round, into fully automatic. So one pull of the trigger, you can empty an entire magazine, which in some cases is a 30-round extended magazine in 2 seconds. So it's a type of what we call an auto sear. So basically, it applies force to the trigger bar of a firearm to prevent it from limiting the firearm to firing one round. So basically moves the trigger bar so that you keep firing, essentially. Kind of the best way of explaining it. So, these devices went from basically being non-existent. I think, maybe there were some early YouTube videos of people using them, but they really took off around 2019. And there's couple reasons for that. Number one, they were able to be 3D printed. So that's one thing, the 3D printing, the rise of 3D printing and the 3D printing industry. Plans were put out on how you could 3D print a Glock switch. And then these would be the plastic 3D printed versions, but then there's also the metal versions, which oftentimes are imported from overseas. So the basic design was shared, and I forget the year that it was shared by the inventor, but the design got out there. China, Russia, we've seen them coming from other foreign countries as well, shipped into the US, the dark web, even some websites that plainly advertise on the web. If you're able to get into the right rooms, you can meet someone who will ship them to you. So we've seen in their just drastic rise. Just to give you the Chicago numbers, we had, I think, 80 recoveries in 2020. And then this year we're on pace to be more than 600. And their use, so this is another thing. We talk about crime gun intelligence and combining all of this. When we put a gun with an MCD, machine gun conversion device affixed, into NIBIN, they're hitting in Chicago at a rate of about 49%. So almost half are linked to other shootings. That really shows you that people are putting these on firearms to do harm, maximize damage to their victims, whereas the rate for all other firearms recovered, as far as the rate they hit in NIBIN, you're looking at closer to 20%. So when a machine gun conversion device is on a firearm, it's for, at least in Chicago, Milwaukee, and the other areas that I cover, it's for one reason only. It's for bad actors to, inflict maximum damage. So it's a huge problem. They've been used in just about half of the mass shootings that occurred here this summer. We know that because even if we don't recover the gun, we have ShotSpotter, which gives us an acoustic gunshot detection and pretty easily can pick up on fully automatic gunfire. They were used by a perpetrator who murdered a Chicago police officer about a year ago. 2 Chicago police officers were murdered, and an MCD was suspected in both cases, even though in one of the cases the firearm was never recovered. So it's a huge problem. University of Chicago, I believe, did a study that said that even though shootings are fewer in frequency in Chicago, they're becoming more lethal. There's 2 things they attribute to that. One is the rise of MCDs and then high-capacity magazines. So combining a high-capacity magazine, a 30-round magazine, a 50-round drum magazine, and the ability just to one quick pull of the trigger, 30 rounds downrange, and you could only imagine the carnage, especially if you're just indiscriminately aiming at a street corner like we have all the time here in Chicago, unfortunately.
And that's one of the problems. I mean, it's hard to hit anything on fully automatic with an actual machine gun. You put it on one of these guns, half the time the only thing these people hit when they fire them are the innocent bystanders. Is you're firing that many bullets and you can't really aim it. And they go, the bullet travels a long way when you fire it. And so they really are terrifying. I know it's a focus of ATF, and hopefully that focus, I'll say this, I'm sometimes critical of some of the 3-letter agencies on our podcast. Love the ATF. I guess you guys are kind of a 4-letter agency now because we've added explosives to the end. Right. Nobody ever calls it the ATFE.
I was going to say, when I read your title, I was like, oh no, have I been calling it incorrectly? Is it ATFE?
And I only think if they want to rib you, they'll call you BATFE. I've heard that before.
Oh, that's good. Mm-hmm. Those statistics are horrific with the 49% hit. And I'm curious just because you have seen so much. You are at the forefront of all of this, kind of on like a positive note. Do you have a story you can share about like an impossible lead if it had not been for NIBIN that you were able to have? You've already talked about some of them, like the gang shootings. That's amazing that the gangs would go out and shoot, and therefore you had, their casings. But do you have something from your career? Maybe you had hit a complete dead end that NIBIN was able to help lead to, cracks in the case.
Yeah. There's so many, but I'll give one great example. When I was in ASAC in the Washington Field Division in Washington, D.C., we had an individual who was murdering homeless people in both D.C. and New York City. So, D.C. again had a great NIBIN program. So you had a series of successive shootings of homeless individuals in D.C. using a .22 caliber pistol. And some of these details I'll have to be careful with because it's still an active investigation, but most of the things have been out there in the affidavit and we've talked about publicly. But the reason this one really sticks out because it brings together everything I've talked about on the podcast today with the cooperation among law enforcement agencies, building crime gun intelligence programs to stop somebody from committing another shooting. So this guy, mentally ill individual, was shooting homeless people in D.C., goes up to New York and does the same thing. So kills a homeless individual in New York. I believe he shoots another So we didn't know there was a connection. So we have the DC ones, and this is happening, I believe, in a succession of days. So we linked the ones in DC via NIBIN. We have a great process there at DC. We had ATF folks working at the lab along with Metropolitan Police Department employees. So we see this thing happens in New York. There was actually a detective in DC who, like me, was from New York. And he's looking at the New York Post, and he looks and he says, that guy kind of looks like the similar grainy surveillance that we have in ours. So the first thing we did, we said, well, let's see what type of ballistic evidence they've recovered in New York. So we, again, having these great partnerships with the ATF and NYPD, we're able to get their cartridge cases entered into NIBIN, and we're able to immediately make the link. So, this is one where you could say, well, it would have happened eventually. You could have done this in the past. You could have just shipped all the evidence and looked at it under a scope and said these two were connected. But the automation and being able to do it quickly led to us arresting this individual before he could reoffend. And what I mean by that, so basically we make that connection, which allowed us to go live. That was the definitive link to say the New York and the DC shootings are connected. 100%, they're ballistically linked. We believe we have the same individual. So we go public, and then what happens when you go public? The tips start flying in. So we get some great tips. Of course, we canvass on the DC shooting. We do an additional canvass. Anyway, we put it all together, and by about 24 hours from the time we made the ballistic link, had the press conference, my team, along with MPD, had eyes on this guy going across DC. So basically, we were able to locate him using some methods and techniques, maybe that some of your prior guests may have discussed. And we were able to identify him, and I'll never forget it, because it was, when we found him, it was the middle of the night, and he was out. And he was likely searching for additional victims. And he was actually stunned when we arrested him and took him into custody at a gas station. And I always say that was the greatest example, because it was that ballistic link that allowed kind of the series of events that had him in custody within 24 hours. 20 years ago, you're talking about 2 laboratories, time. We wouldn't have known if they were connected. We would have potentially taken a lot more time to put that together, which I firmly believe, no, he would have kept on with his activity. We did not recover the gun in that case, believe that he discarded that sometime throughout that, perhaps when we were doing surveillance. But I'll always say that brought together everything, because it was 2 labs that had best practices. I knew the lab director up in New York through running the NIBIN program. The ASAC for ATF in New York was great. Their chief department there, the chief of detectives, same with everybody in DC. It was just a team effort, no egos. And we were able to get that. I'll never forget when I heard on the radio that I was a boss at the time. So unfortunately I wasn't out. I was sitting there in the office listening when, my team said, we have eyes on him, we're going to move. And that was it. Prevented future victims. So that would be probably the best example, and the one that I thought was the most impactful. And there's just hundreds of others from my time as a group supervisor and agent as well. But that one really stands out.
I mean, it really is incredible because, like you said, every hour counted in terms of saving lives. And if he was out trolling that night, just based on, previous record, that probably wasn't going to be, the previous victim probably wasn't going to be his last. And I know there's so many you can't talk about, but I think people can get a flavor of the incredible work that you get to do with ATF, that NIBIN gets to do, and the technology gets to do in generating these leads and stopping violent criminals in their tracks before more violent crime is committed, which obviously in the current state of, crime in the country is something that we absolutely need. I know we are closing in on an hour. We could probably ask you a million questions. Brett, you look like you're chomping at the bit. Did I cut off any of the questions you wanted to ask our expert?
No, not at all. I mean, I just want to say thank you for your service and everything you do. You guys really do save lives every day, and you don't get enough credit for it.
Thank you. And likewise for you guys as well, and all your service as well. I really appreciate it. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about my favorite topic, which is ATF's mission and the work we do.
Thank you so much. I mean, is there anything else that we didn't ask you about that you'd like people to know about the work you do or the work ATF does, and maybe how lay people can be of help when it comes to the investigations and the leads generated by ATF?
Yeah, I would just, stress the importance of reporting, gun crimes in your community. I mean, I gave that example of the serial killer in Washington, D.C., and just because of the nature of those crimes and everything, just the amount of tips we got, but just the everyday violence that plagues our communities. It's easy to become kind of numb, especially here in Chicago and Washington, D.C., but just really being vigilant and assisting law enforcement is so important. I mean, we're a very small agency. I will say that, 2,500 special agents, 5,000 total employees. And I mentioned this, very important mission that we have. So we need all the help we can get, whether it's using technology our partnerships are really our force multiplier. We couldn't exist without our state and local partnerships and the great police departments that we work with, state, local. Chicago Police, where I am here, is just a fantastic partner, one of the best police departments I've worked with. DC Metro 2, Denver Police Department, even though I didn't think much of Denver when I got selected there. It ended up being one of the best places I've ever worked, and everywhere in between, from the rural sheriffs to the big cities.
That's an incredible call to action for people to stay vigilant and to view law enforcement as partners in their community as well. I did not realize how small ATF is, because you guys truly are everywhere in the cases that we prosecute and seem to have an incredible reach in the cases that you help investigate and help ultimately solve. So thank you for your service of 20 years to ATF. Thank you to your colleagues for all you do. We truly mean this. We know that you put your own safety on the line every day in order to better our communities. And I hope that you'll come back again someday, because I bet you when this episode drops, it's going to be everyone's favorite, and they're going to ask so many more questions, and we are going to be woefully unable to answer their questions. So Chris, thank you for your time today. It is late at night. We're making you record, after work hours. And so we thank you. But you all, we have been given such a treat to be able to hear from the experts at ATF. Let us know what you think. And if you have more questions, write them in as well. And we'll try to see if Chris will come back and answer them. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And I'm Chris.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
Talk about. I should just come up with some random story. So today, by the way, the kids started school. Both kids started real school today, and it was tough. Little guy didn't necessarily have to start real school today, but we decided to go ahead and send him with his sister, which I think made them both happy. But I was very emotional. It was there were tears. There was much sobbing on my part, not on their part. As we left, I told my wife a little bit more separation anxiety would have been appreciated. Instead, it was just, bye.